Welcome. I'm Dr. Gene Fitzhugh. I hope you like that introduction because you'll see that many times when you take Kinesiology 350, Physical Activity Epidemiology. I'm the person coordinating that totally online, asynchronized class. We may actually never meet in person because of the way we have that class formatted, even formatted that way before COVID. A little bit about myself, y'all, and by that I mean I'm from Kentucky. I grew up in central Kentucky around the horse farms. I worked a variety of farm jobs. I was the first person from my family to get a college degree. I ran track and cross country competitively in college. I continued to run until the age of 40 when I blew out my Achilles tendon. I'm now a very avid cyclist. I'm on track to get about 14,000 miles this year. I went to the University of Alabama, and your professors coordinating your 200 intro class will just be shaking their heads right about now, I would imagine. I get a hoot out of teasing everybody here at UT. But I bleed blue for Kentucky basketball. Been here in Knoxville since 1995. Love Knoxville, love the area. And I've integrated my research into the community here. I've evaluated how people use greenways for physical activity. I'm evaluating right now mountain bike trails in the urban wilderness to see how people use the trails and how much physical activity they're getting. I've done a lot of research in chronic disease and physical activity in terms of the protection you get from physical activity or the risk you get if you're inactive. That's about it for me. I've got a I've got a PowerPoint presentation I'd like for you I'll walk you through. To give you an idea what physical activity epidemiology involves. In fact, you've been taking a crash course in epi this past year in 2020 with the COVID pandemic that we have. That basically everything you've been reading about the COVID is epidemiology, based on epidemiology. For our class, we're taking epidemiology methods and looking at physical activity as it relates to disease. So let's go on to the lecture. Ciao. I'll see you after that lecture.
Hey, well, let's look at physical activity epidemiology with a brief introduction to epi and transition that to what the focus is for physical activity epidemiology. Your textbook will be physical activity epidemiology. Each week you'll have a chapter assigned to you. You'll also have an extra reading on a typical week of a research study. And in a typical week, you may have 1 to 2 quizzes that are due on the Sunday after that week. Now, you'll have 13, 14, 15 quizzes. You'll have 3 exams. And the key skill set for you outside of focusing is time management and allocating assignments and readings spread out through the week so that you're not studying on a Sunday to get ready for the deadline of our quiz. The class is totally online. It's asynchronized. You'll have no set day or time to complete the work. It's basically up to you to allocate when you're actually going to focus on the content of the class. Epidemiology, we're looking at the distribution and the determinants of health-related states or events, very simply disease or mortality. getting the disease, dying from the disease. And we're looking at specific human populations. Now, the COVID is an excellent example of how we're looking at the distribution of the disease across age groups, race and ethnicity groups, uh, rural, urban, states, the world. All of this is focusing on the human populations and who's most at risk. Now, personally, I'm very much at risk for COVID because we know through epidemiology that anybody over the age of 60 is, if they contract the COVID, are likely or could have an increased risk for some adverse event. Now, once we know about how the disease transmits between people and across communities and populations, we can begin to think about the prevention and controlling the actual transmission of the disease or developing a chronic disease. So we have several major things we focus on in epidemiology. How much disease is there in a population of people? We're talking about incidence rates, prevalence rates, mortality rates, things that you'll be learning how to calculate in class. We focus on who's getting it, who's more likely to get the disease or develop the disease. Where is it occurring? Because we know geographically some areas may get higher rates of disease than others. When is it occurring? It is October. Influenza is beginning to occur. We know that's somewhat seasonal. We know the COVID is not seasonal. It's right now it's a pandemic and there's no seasonal transmissions. It's here within our community and there's no easing or increasing in sight. Once we know how it's transmitting among people, again, we can look at causal and preventive factors. And lastly, we begin to implement interventions and try to impact the determinants and then follow the course of the disease. Now, with our COVID vaccine trials going on right now, we are basically looking at, with certain types of vaccines, how will that decrease risk, or will it decrease risk, or will it have many other adverse effects? We don't know any of that yet. So the COVID follows this track, as well as physical activity or physical inactivity. Now, physical activity epidemiologists largely look at chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, hypertension, which underlies disease, elevated cholesterol, obesity. It's very complicated, and because chronic diseases are the main focus, we're looking at tracking people not from COVID for 14 days or looking about when they may be hospitalized and surviving, but we're looking at perhaps 20, 30, 40, 50 years before we see the exposure of physical inactivity and the risk of developing disease. So we're looking at long studies that last a long, long time that have to track a large group of people. So when we talk about the ultimate experience, health experience, we talk about mortality, and that is an ultimate endpoint for physical activity epidemiology. This is the most recent life expectancy chart figure for the United States, and it's comparing 2017 and 2018. You'll note if a child's born today, they can be expected to live for 79 years. And there is a significant difference between men and women. And I'm 62 at this point. Basically, if I were 65, I could be expected to live 18 more years, as you'll see in the very lower half of that particular chart. So we can look at, do people who are physically inactive, sedentary for most of their life, do they have a shorter life expectancy or a longer? And in fact, we know it is shorter, but you'll be surprised to know it's not that much shorter. The big difference is the quality of life. Living with a physical uh, disability is more likely to occur to someone who's been sedentary most of their life. The quality of life, years of living, are longer and greater for people who are physically active. And that's what you'll be studying to a large degree for most of the major chronic diseases. Now, speaking of chronic diseases, here are the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. You'll see that heart disease, which used to be number 2, is number 1, cancer. We see respiratory diseases in number 4, stroke. Alzheimer's disease over the last 2 decades has made an increased appearance on these top 10 lists because we now know what to diagnose and we're better diagnosing it. Diabetes, I'm pre-diabetic, and this is a big concern to me because I know my physical activity that I'm getting now is delaying when I'm probably going to be diagnosed as type 2 diabetic, which will probably happen at some point before I die. Influenza, pneumonia, people over the age of 65 need to be concerned with this. Of course, you see suicide at the very bottom. Unintentional injuries are also on this list. These are things that also have increased over time. And when we look at time, here's the year 1900 to the year 2020. Now look at the trend of selected causes of death: heart disease, cancer, stroke, respiratory diseases, and accidents. For the year 2000, they're actually there, and they're the leading causes. But look at the very earlier part in 1900. Influenza and pneumonia, tuberculosis, diarrhea, and then heart disease and stroke were really a little bit lower. We've seen a change from infectious diseases being the leading cause of death to chronic diseases. And there's a variety of different reasons why that we even see all of these decreasing. It's because of better health care, as well as preventive behaviors being adopted in society. People are not smoking as much. People are drinking less alcohol. There are a variety of different things, as well as people being more physically active. I'll get into more detail of this when we have our class, because we do want to know how trends are occurring, and specifically how physical activity is underlying some of the reasons why we see these trends. So in terms of chronic disease, over time, which is the central part of this particular model of physical activity epidemiology, time, 30, 40, 50 years, we track groups of people. We look at their demographics. We also look on the lower right-hand part, where do they live? What's their behavior? The culture that they're exposed to. Their physiological factors, as well as, again, their environment and ecological elements about where they particularly live. From that, we can determine what the causative factors are. Now, for physical activity, we're looking at groups of people, how they behave, where they live, where they work, what they do for leisure time. All of that begins to gives us an idea of the increased risk or decreased risk of chronic disease. Okay, I don't know if you've ever been to London, but any physical activity epidemiologist, and you as a student, when you take the class, you'll recognize this, understand it for what it is. The first physical activity epidemiology study was the London Bus Study, or the London Transport Study. Dr. Jeremy Morris in London studied conductors and drivers in an occupational focus. He was wondering why that conductors who walked up and down taking tickets had lower cases of heart disease. He compared the sedentary drivers and the conductors. And this is what he basically found among the transport workers. The conductors were half as likely to have a heart attack. And if they did, they were half as likely to die from that particular heart attack. So he hypothesized it was the activity of moving that gave the conductors protection against heart disease. This study, published in 1953, set the tone for how we approached studying physical activity. We've started off with occupational physical activity because it was very convenient to study. Now, most epidemiologists study leisure time physical activity because from an occupational standpoint, the hard energy expenditure types of jobs have been decreasing over time with automation and other developments in our culture. Now, let me give you an example of how challenging it is. And as a student of kinesiology and as a future healthcare provider, if you want to be a physician or a nurse or physician's assistant, you're going to have to consider the multiple risk factors and how you interact with your patients and how we promote health promoting health behavior. So here's a hypothetical model of how atherosclerosis develops. Now you note we've got 4 solid lines going to atherosclerosis: smoking, hypertension, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and then elevated blood lipids. All of those directly impact the development of atherosclerosis. Now, all of us, including you, we all are developing atherosclerotic plaques. But these other lines that are coming to atherosclerosis, you'll note the dash lines. There are 2 of them. The dietary factors in terms of the amount of kilocalories and the fat content of your diet. And then the physical activity, the caloric expenditure, also relates to atherosclerosis. But complicating this is that we know overweight and obesity, which is really the big driver here, relates to type 2 diabetes, and your physical activity and your diet relates to overweight and being obese, related to hypertension, blood lipids, and of course we have the underlying factor of genetics. Now, this is the challenge of the epidemiologist focusing on physical activity, and it will be the challenge for you too, is deciphering the indirect pathways and the direct pathways towards that disease. I've been studying a lot related to type 2 diabetes, and physical activity, the modeling, and the risk and protection associated with physical activity is intermingled among different risk factors, and we have to measure all of them in our studies. So ultimately, let me show you what the class is about. This is sort of a summary slide even, and it's setting the guidelines or the background for how we're learning about promoting physical activity and helping people become more active and less sedentary. I'm going to use the word dose response. Dose is the amount of physical activity a person gets, and that's on the bottom axis of this particular figure. So on the left side, you've got sedentary behavior, and as we move to the right, the dose or the level of physical activity increases. Now we can measure that via minutes of moderate and vigorous physical activity, kcal energy expenditure, met minutes. You're going to spend one chapter just learning about how we measure physical activity. On the axis related to disease, that's the response, the likelihood of developing disease. So the lower part here is a low risk. As we increase, there's increased risk for developing disease. And remember, we're looking at age, gender, race, education, a variety of different factors, including genetic factors, where people live, their behaviors, family history, genetics. So coronary heart disease, here's a dose response curve. We've got, remember, sedentary people here. Sedentary people are our reference group. They're the most likely to develop heart disease over time. But as physical activity increases, what's happening? The risk goes down. The likelihood of being diagnosed with heart disease goes down. In fact, as it continues, we see it slowly leveling off. But even as volumes of physical activity increase, we see the risk going down. So the dose response curve is really the gold standard of where we as epidemiologists want to focus on. Here's stroke. Very similar to heart disease because they are cardiovascular in nature. But what's happening at the high end here? We know that large amounts of physical activity, kcal, met minutes, typically involve, to get those large amounts, you've got to conduct very intense physical activity. And there are some studies that think that that intensity may expose genetic problems related to the brain that may lead to aneurysms, cerebrovascular strokes that can lead to death. So that's kind of uncertain right now, but that's what we suspect. Diabetes, this is me. The risk doesn't go down as far as with heart disease, but it's very similar in nature in terms of it's a fairly steady decrease. The more physical activity you get, the steadier, lower risk you have. Now, with diabetes, we also need to be thinking about not only aerobic activity, but musculoskeletal activity. And it's the musculoskeletal activity that is getting a lot of attention now. We think that if you don't do any aerobic physical activity, but if you do musculoskeletal related activities twice a week, you're getting just as much benefit as if you were running an equivalent of 300 minutes of moderate intensity, or in this case, 150 minutes of running equals 300 minutes of walking. Equivalency, 2 days of lifting weights may give you just as equal benefit. So it's a new area of physical activity epidemiology. Functional health status. This relates to perhaps falls and the mortality of elderly people being able to have quality years of life where they're not physically disabled and can function a normal life. You'll see very low amounts of physical activity, just kind of really moving, gives great benefit. And once you get to a fairly low level of physical activity, boy, you're pretty much not as likely to have problems down the road. However, I put this in here just to show you, and this probably shouldn't be a surprise, musculoskeletal injury. As you increase physical activity, the intensity, the duration, the number of days, the frequency, the likelihood of getting hurt is increasing. Now, when I was 40 years old, in fact, on my birthday, I ran a 5K, won the race, but 100 meters from the finish, that's when my Achilles tendon blew out on me. I had been running about 90 miles a week, even at that age. I had been pushing the high levels of physical activity. So the odds of my having that happen to me, pretty darn good. And of course, now I'm getting large volumes of exercise through cycling, which is also helping me with all of these particular diseases, but particularly diabetes. And then here's the big one, prevention of weight gain. This is something that most people struggle with because we know that the risk, the odds of maintaining a normal weight, you have to get fairly large amounts of physical activity to have that occur. Now, most adults aren't aware of that, and we've got to think about balancing the minimum physical activity needed to get all of these great benefits right here versus this maximum number or minimum for prevention of weight gain. They're two different things. I know most people who become active in middle age, it's actually because they want to lose weight. And unfortunately, when they start, excuse me, get to these higher levels, we see musculoskeletal injury risk increasing. So it's a fine balance. And it, actually leads into the physical activity guidelines for Americans. So the estimated gains in life expectancy for physical inactivity, this is one of the first readings you're going to see. It actually, there's been a great study that was published in the Lancet article. You'll note that South America, they may get an extra year of life. That's it, if they were to eliminate physical inactivity and just get people moving. The United States, we're not even up to a year of extra life. In fact, some of the countries in Asia won't gain much in life expectancy. And this is related to a physical inactivity, which is a separate risk factor compared to physical activity. And we'll talk more about the reasons why. What is not reflected here is the years of quality of life gained by being physically active. We know that's the big benefit there. Okay, I want to go to the last slide. This is it. This is the physical activity guidelines for Americans. This is what it's all based on. This is all-cause mortality, the relationship of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So if you're walking, moderate intensity. If you're jogging, vigorous. Take all of the minutes you accumulate during the day, and we can convert those to met hours per week using the metabolic equivalent. 3 mets for walking, 3.3 mets for walking. Vigorous typically has a metabolic equivalent of 6 or more. My cycling is usually about a 10 to 11 met level. So if I do 1 hour of cycling at 10 mets, I'm getting 600 met minutes, or basically 10 hours a week or more. In fact, I'm way up here in terms of my meds. Looking at the referent group, people who are sedentary, the greatest amount of benefit, 70% of all the health benefits associated with physical activity occur at 8.25 met hours per week, which is equivalent to 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And that benefit, here's the sweet spot, 150 to 300. If a person gains that much of many minutes per week, And it doesn't matter really if you're healthy. A reading you're going to look at is if you're healthy and you get most of your moderate and vigorous intensity activity in the weekend for 2 days a week, you're going to get as much benefit as someone who spreads it out across the week. That's why you don't see frequency mentioned in our new guidelines. And physical activity epidemiology, all of the studies were used to determine in the last decade, frequency doesn't matter except for some diseases. Now, for diabetics, for pre-diabetics, frequency does matter because we have to look at blood glucose control. And once we get above 300, we still, I'm going to go all the way over here. The hazard ratio is 0.6. That means there's a 40% reduction in all-cause mortalities for various diseases. That is almost cutting your risk in half. So when you do see decreased risk at this high end, but there's no increased risk of premature death. So it doesn't increase. So that stroke dose response curve doesn't really demonstrate itself when we look at all causes of mortality. And this is driving, and this is the physical activity guidelines for Americans. 150 to 300 minutes of moderate physical activity. Now, if you're doing vigorous activity, that's 75 minutes of vigorous, up to 150 minutes of vigorous, because for roughly every minute of vigorous physical activity, it equates to 2 minutes of moderate physical activity. Well, just to summarize, physical activity epidemiology tracks chronic disease among populations. We measure physical activity, and we measure other possible confounders, hypertension, other things that relate to the disease we're focusing on, following people for 20, 30, 40 years. We can calculate their risk. If they're sedentary, we see increased risk. If people are active, we see decreased risk. And the whole field of epidemiology is looking at trying to define the dose response curve, finding that sweet spot so that we can tell people this is what you have to get to minimize the risk you have for premature death or developing disease. Okay, I'm going to pause and say I look forward to working with you in the next couple of years. I imagine most of you all will take 350 fairly quickly, if some of you all may actually be in it. Stay well. And for this semester, wear a mask, social distancing, and don't go to bars. Ciao.